Throughout this trial, he stared blankly ahead, never looking at evidence that was shown on the large projector in the courtroom. He never cried when graphic, horrific photos of Emma's bruised body.
A quiet town, a place where the days moved slowly, where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, and where crime was something you read about in the news. Ripley, West Virginia, wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. It wasn't the kind of place where fear seeped into the walls, but that changed forever on one October morning. At the center of this story is a child, barely old enough to take her first steps, a baby whose laugh could melt even the hardest heart. She was born into love, surrounded by a family who adored her, protected her. But love and protection weren't enough to shield her from the evil that had quietly made its way into their home. The night before everything changed, the Barringer home was like any other. A mother tucked her children into bed, kissed their foreheads, and closed her eyes, never once imagining that her worst nightmare was already unfolding beneath her feet. The walls that should have protected them concealed something no one could have predicted: a man. Someone she trusted, someone who had blended into their lives so seamlessly, who had been welcomed into their home, their hearts. He was there when they laughed, when they celebrated, when they built dreams for the future. But behind his carefully curated smile lurked something far more sinister. In the early hours of the morning, while the world outside was silent and still, a monster revealed itself. A tiny crib, empty, a mother stirring in her sleep, unaware of the horror just feet away. A basement door left ajar, leading into a darkness that swallowed innocence whole. By the time the sun rose, everything had changed. This isn't just another crime story. This is a case so disturbing, so unfathomable, that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. It left an entire town reeling, a mother shattered, and a courtroom silent in disbelief as the truth unraveled. What happened inside that home? What was hidden behind the charm of the man who seemed so ordinary? And how could something this horrific take place under the same roof as a family who only wanted love and safety? This is the horrifying case of Emmaleigh Barringer, a case that forces us to confront the darkest corners of humanity, a case that will never be forgotten. Emmaleigh Barringer was never meant to survive. That's what doctors had said when she was born, 8 weeks too soon, small enough to fit in the crook of her mother's arm, her body fragile but her will strong. But she did survive. She fought for every breath, for every heartbeat. From the very beginning, she had defied the odds, proving that she was stronger than she seemed. By the time she was 10 months old, the world around her had begun to take shape in ways she was only just starting to understand. Every day was a new discovery, a new sound, a new face, a new moment that made her eyes widen with wonder. She had already begun babbling, forming the first hints of words that, had she been given the chance, would have one day shaped her voice. She had just started taking her first unsteady steps, falling more often than not, only to be scooped up into her mother's arms, reassured with laughter and kisses. Her world was a simple one, safe, surrounded by love. Amanda Adkins, her mother, had always described her as a gift. Her tiny warrior, the child who had fought so hard to live. She had done everything she could to protect her, to give her the best life possible. And it wasn't just Amanda who loved her. Emmaleigh had 3 older siblings, each with their own way of showing affection. Nathaniel, her eldest brother, at 7 years old, already carried himself with a sense of quiet responsibility. He knew what it meant to be the oldest, even if he couldn't yet put it into words. To him, Emmaleigh was someone to be looked after, someone to guard in the way that big brothers do. He would stand beside her crib when she cried, whispering soft reassurances that only a sibling could offer. Carly, just a year younger than Nathaniel, had a different kind of bond with her baby sister. She was the entertainer, the one who spun around the living room in endless circles, her laughter filling the house as Emmaleigh clapped along. To Carly, she wasn't just a sibling, she was a built-in best friend, a little shadow who would one day follow her lead. Then there was Cameron, the 2-year-old, too young to fully grasp what having a baby sister meant, but old enough to love her in the way only a child can. He would sit beside her, offering her toys he didn't quite want to share, giggling as she reached for him with chubby fingers. They didn't need words, just the simple comfort of each other's presence. This was the life Emmaleigh had. A life of laughter, a life of warmth, a life of safety. Or at least, that's what Amanda had believed. She had done everything right. She had built a home where her children could grow without fear. She had made choices that she thought would give them a better future. And then, one choice changed everything. When Amanda met Benjamin Taylor, she thought she had finally found someone she could rely on. Someone who could stand beside her, help her raise her children, share in the life she had built. He had seemed like the perfect man, kind, affectionate, always eager to be involved. He played with the kids, made them laugh, blended so seamlessly into their world that it felt natural to have him there. To Amanda, he was everything she had hoped for. To Emmaleigh, he was just another familiar face in her small, simple world. But what no one knew, what no one could have seen, was that Benjamin Taylor wasn't who he pretended to be. He had hidden the truth well, concealed the darkness beneath a mask of charm. He had earned their trust, settled into their home, convinced everyone that he belonged there, and all the while he had been waiting. It's impossible to say when the shift happened, when he stopped being the man Amanda thought he was, when the thoughts in his mind turned from something unspoken to something real. But what is certain, what no one can deny, is that on the night of October 2, 2016, something inside him broke. The Barringer house was quiet that night, the way homes with children always are in the late hours. Amanda had tucked her kids into bed, kissed them goodnight, and drifted off into sleep, never once imagining that downstairs, just beyond the glow of the living room light, something unimaginable was about to happen. Emmaleigh was still awake. At just 10 months old, she was still too little to understand fear, too young to recognize when something wasn't right. She had spent the day in the comfort of her family, the same as any other. There was no reason for her to believe that anything had changed. But in the silence of that house, in the shadows that stretched across the floor, there was someone watching her. No one knows the exact moment he made his decision. No one knows what was going through his mind when he walked toward her. What is known, what is certain, is that at some point that night, Benjamin Taylor picked up Emmaleigh and carried her away from the world she had known, away from the safety of her crib, away from the warmth of her home, and down into the darkness of the basement. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the baby who had fought so hard to live, the child who had been so loved, was gone. Her laughter silenced, her family broken, and the man who had once smiled at them all had revealed the truth of who he really was. What happened in that basement changed everything. It shattered the illusion of safety, turned a family's home into a crime scene, and left a town reeling in horror. Amanda would wake up to a reality she never could have prepared for, a nightmare that no mother should ever have to face. And as the truth unfolded, as the weight of what had been done settled into the hearts of those who heard it, one question remained. How could this happen? How could someone so trusted, so accepted into their lives, commit something so unthinkable? The answer to that question would come in time, but the horror of that night would never be forgotten. Benjamin Taylor entered Amanda Adkins' life at a time when she believed she had found stability. Raising 4 children on her own was not easy, but she had done it with resilience, creating a home filled with warmth and love. Like many single mothers, she longed for companionship, someone who could share in her struggles, lighten the burdens, and offer the kind of love she had gone so long without. And then she met him. Benjamin Taylor was everything she thought she wanted. He was attentive, affectionate, and seemed genuinely invested in her and her children. He made himself available in ways that made Amanda feel seen and appreciated. He played with the kids, helped around the house, and talked about building a future together. He knew all the right words to say, all the right moves to make. It wasn't long before Amanda was completely taken in. She believed she had finally found the missing piece in her life, someone she could trust, someone who cared. But trust is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. What Amanda didn't know, what no one knew, was that Taylor had been hiding something beneath the surface of his charming facade. His past was not as clean as he made it seem. He had a criminal record, burglary, parole violations, a history that suggested he was no stranger to crossing lines, to disregarding boundaries. But he never spoke of it. He never gave Amanda a reason to doubt him. His smiles were genuine, his gestures sincere, and when he changed his Facebook status to "in a relationship," it felt like confirmation that everything was falling into place. To Amanda, it was love. To Taylor, it was an opportunity. People like him do not act on impulse. They plan, they manipulate, they blend in. And Taylor did it masterfully. For weeks he played the role of the devoted boyfriend, integrating himself into Amanda's family, becoming a figure of comfort and familiarity. He held Emmaleigh in his arms. He watched her play. He sat beside Amanda's other children at the dinner table. He laughed with them, read to them, earned their trust in ways that seemed effortless. There was no reason to suspect him, no reason to look at him and see anything other than what he wanted them to see. But behind those affectionate smiles, there was something else, something darker. And while Amanda lay beside him at night, believing she had finally found the man who would stand beside her, she had no way of knowing the kind of thoughts that had taken root in his mind, the kind of thoughts that would soon shatter her world. It's impossible to pinpoint the exact moment Taylor's intentions shifted, the moment he looked at Emmaleigh and saw something beyond what he should have seen. What is known, what investigators would later uncover, is that he had been searching. His phone told a story of its own, a timeline of inquiries, disturbing patterns, questions that hinted at thoughts most people could never fathom. But at the time, no one saw it. To the outside world, he was still just Amanda's boyfriend, the man who played with her kids, the man she was planning a future with. The truth of who he really was, what he was capable of, would not be revealed until it was too late. On the night of October 2nd, 2016, the mask he had so carefully worn began to slip. By then, Taylor had been living with Amanda and her children for only a short time, but already he had embedded himself deeply into their lives. They trusted him, depended on him. He was a part of their family. That night, as Amanda and her 3 older children went to bed, there was no reason to suspect that anything was wrong. No reason to believe that while they slept peacefully, something horrifying was happening just beyond the safety of their bedrooms. Because monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they hold your child's hand. And sometimes they sleep beside you at night, whispering promises of love, even as their minds wander toward something far more sinister. In the darkness of that house, Benjamin Taylor made a decision, one that would change everything. The family who had welcomed him, who had trusted him, would wake to a reality that no one could ever prepare for. And the innocent baby girl who had once clapped her hands at the sound of her sister's laughter, who had once nestled in the arms of her mother with complete trust, would never wake again. It would take time for the full truth to come to light, but by the time it did, there would be no question. The man who had been welcomed into their home, the man Amanda had believed in, the man who had kissed her goodnight, was not the man she thought he was. He was something else entirely, and the moment he revealed himself, the world they had built was destroyed. It was just past midnight when the world inside the Barringer home began to shift. The air was still, thick with the silence that only exists in a house full of sleeping children. Outside, the small town of Ripley lay motionless under the dim glow of streetlights. No one had any reason to suspect that inside one of its quietest homes, something terrible was about to unfold. Amanda Adkins had gone to bed hours earlier, her children tucked safely into their rooms. It had been an ordinary day, the kind that blurred into the next without much thought. But while Amanda and her 3 older children slept, one person remained awake. Benjamin Taylor. In the dim light of the living room, he sat alone, unmoving. His mind was somewhere else. Perhaps it had been for days, maybe weeks. The mask he had worn so convincingly, the one that had made Amanda trust him, welcome him into her home, had begun to slip. And then, at some point in the night, he got up. Across the room, Emmaleigh was still awake. She was sitting in her baby swing, her tiny fingers wrapped around the fabric straps, blinking up at the ceiling with the quiet curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to fear the dark. She had spent her short life surrounded by love, comfort, the warmth of her family. She had no reason to be afraid. Taylor walked toward her. No one knows what was going through his mind in that moment. No one can say with certainty when he made the decision that would change everything. But what is known, what investigators would later piece together, is that at some point he lifted her from the swing, and he carried her away, down the narrow staircase, through the basement door, into the darkness. The house above remained silent. The walls that had once kept this family safe now concealed something unspeakable. Hours passed, and then at 4 a.m. Amanda stirred. At first it was nothing more than the vague disorientation that comes with waking in the middle of the night. The house was quiet, but something felt wrong. A sensation she couldn't explain, an unease pressing at the edges of her mind. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and glanced toward the crib. It was empty. A rush of confusion jolted her fully awake. Emmaleigh wasn't there. A mother's instinct is a powerful thing. It isn't logical or measured, it's immediate. It seizes you without warning, tightening around your ribs, sending ice down your spine. Amanda threw off the blankets, heart pounding as she scanned the room. Maybe Taylor had taken her downstairs to rock her back to sleep. Maybe she was in her swing in the living room. She hurried out of the bedroom, checking each space as she moved through the house. The swing sat empty. The couch was vacant. Taylor was nowhere to be found, and then her eyes landed on the basement door. It was open. A sliver of light spilled from the bottom of the stairs, a flickering glow in the otherwise darkened house. Amanda hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. And then she stepped forward. With each creak of the wooden stairs beneath her, her heartbeat pounded louder. Her fingers brushed against the wall, searching for stability as she descended into the dimly lit basement. And then she saw him. Benjamin Taylor, kneeling over Emmaleigh. For a moment, Amanda couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Her mind rejected it, twisting reality into something less horrifying, something that made sense. But then, Emmaleig's tiny body came into focus, still, motionless. Something in Amanda shattered. She rushed forward, grabbing her daughter from the floor, cradling her against her chest. Emmaleig's skin was cold, too cold. She turned on Taylor, screaming, demanding answers, but he barely reacted. His voice was flat, indifferent. He muttered something about wiping Emmaleigh off, a response so hollow, so disturbingly casual that it made her stomach churn. Amanda didn't hesitate. She ran. Up the stairs, through the house, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The call that followed was one of pure agony. Her voice, cracking with desperation, pleaded for help. She didn't need to explain what had happened. Her scream said enough. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the street. The small, quiet home that had once been a place of comfort was now a crime scene. Police entered to find Amanda on the front porch, Emmaleigh in her arms, her face streaked with tears. She couldn't let go. Inside, Benjamin Taylor stood, unfazed. When officers ordered him to lift his shirt, the room fell into an eerie silence. Dark stains. On his torso and thighs, he mumbled something incoherent, something about getting dirty when he picked her up. It wasn't convincing, it wasn't enough. Taylor was placed in handcuffs, and for the first time since the night began, the nightmare was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was in plain view. Emmaleigh was rushed to the hospital, but deep down, Amanda already knew. The damage had been done. By the time the doctors examined her, it was clear. She would never wake up. 2 days later, Amanda was faced with an impossible decision. With trembling hands, she stroked her daughter's soft hair one last time. Then she let her go. The machines were turned off, and the tiny warrior, the baby who had fought so hard to live, was gone. Her laughter would never fill the house again. Her tiny feet would never take the steps she had just begun to master. And the man who had once been trusted, who had sat beside this family at the dinner table, who had kissed Amanda with affection, had been hiding something so dark, so unfathomable, that it defied understanding. The town of Ripley would never be the same, because on that night, innocence wasn't just stolen. It was extinguished, and the world for those who knew and loved Emmaleigh would never feel safe again. The aftermath of the crime scene on Meadowlark Lane left a quiet town in disbelief. The home that once echoed with laughter now stood behind yellow crime scene tape, a silent witness to the unthinkable. The investigators who stepped inside weren't just met with tragedy, they were met with something far darker. Inside the basement, the room where it happened, the air was thick with something unspoken. The walls, the floor, every inch of the space became part of the story. What investigators found wasn't just evidence, it was a map leading to the truth. Taylor, still in police custody, had muttered excuses when questioned. He had claimed he didn't know what had happened. He had spoken of being too intoxicated to remember. But his words were empty, easily unraveled by the weight of forensic science. The first piece of the puzzle was right in front of them. Taylor's clothing. The officers had already seen it the night they arrived. Dark stains on his torso, on his jeans. When ordered to lift his shirt, he had barely reacted. He had muttered something about getting dirty when he picked her up. That was a lie. Forensic experts later confirmed the presence of blood and other biological evidence on Taylor's clothing, evidence that tied him directly to what had happened in that basement. But that was only the beginning. Investigators turned to Emmaleigh herself, to the injuries she had sustained, the ones the medical examiners would later detail in their reports. Severe skull fractures, signs of smothering, evidence of a struggle too horrific to put into words. The kind of injuries no accident could explain. While the forensics team processed the physical evidence, investigators turned to another critical source. The digital trail Taylor had left behind. His phone told a story of its own. Hours before the crime, Taylor had been online. His search history painted a disturbing picture. Explicit content viewed just before the moment he had taken Emmaleigh from her swing. It wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't impulsive, it was something far worse. The final nail in Taylor's defense came from the words he spoke when he thought no one was listening. Inside the walls of a jail cell, recorded calls captured his voice, his own words becoming part of the case against him. "I did do something bad, but I didn't molest her," he had said. But the facts told another story. With each new piece of evidence, Taylor's excuses crumbled. His claims of memory loss, of intoxication, of not knowing what had happened, fell apart under the weight of the truth. When investigators finally confronted him, when all the evidence was laid out before him, he had no defense. Because there was none, the town of Ripley, West Virginia had long been a place where people trusted their neighbors, where families raised their children without fear. That trust was now shattered. Inside the Jackson County Courthouse, a man who had once been welcomed into a family sat before a jury, accused of crimes that defied comprehension. The prosecution wasted no time in painting the full picture of what had happened that night. Amanda Adkins took the stand. The mother who had once believed she had found love, the woman who had trusted Taylor enough to bring him into her home, was now faced with the reality of his betrayal. She spoke of waking up that night, of searching for her daughter, of the moment she saw Taylor kneeling over Emmaleig's lifeless body. The courtroom was silent as she recounted those final, desperate moments, her voice breaking, her grief filling every corner of the room. Then came the experts, the forensic team. They walked the jury through the crime scene, pointing to the evidence, the blood, the DNA, the injuries. They showed how Taylor's story didn't align with the facts. The digital analysts, they explained Taylor's search history, the disturbing pattern of behavior leading up to the crime, the recorded jail calls. Played for the jury, Taylor's own voice became part of the evidence against him. His words, spoken without remorse, filled the room. And finally, the medical examiner, the one who had examined Emmaleig's small broken body, who had confirmed the skull fractures, the trauma, the things that no child should ever endure. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Taylor's attorneys had little to offer. His defense, that he didn't remember, that he had been drinking, that there was no definitive DNA evidence linking him directly to the crime. It wasn't enough. Because the truth wasn't just in the evidence, it was in the absence of emotion, the complete lack of remorse, the silence in his eyes. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. They returned with a verdict, guilty. On all charges: first-degree murder, death of a child by child abuse, assault by a guardian, custodian, or person in a position of trust. The recommendation? No mercy. Because mercy was something Emmaleigh had never been given. On March 6, 2019, Benjamin Taylor stood before the court as the judge handed down his sentence. Life in prison. No possibility of parole, no second chances, no way out. Taylor showed no emotion, no apology, no reaction at all, because monsters don't always feel regret, and in the eyes of the law, he wasn't just guilty, he was beyond redemption. The trial ended, the sentence was final, but for those who had loved Emmaleigh, justice was never going to be enough, because no courtroom, no verdict, no prison sentence could undo what had been done. No ruling could bring her back. But her name would not be forgotten. Her case would go on to change the laws of West Virginia. In April 2017, Governor Jim Justice signed Emmaleig's Law, increasing penalties for crimes resulting in the death of a child. The legislation ensured that the next person who committed such an act would face even harsher consequences. Because of Emmaleigh, the law would no longer be lenient. Because of Emmaleigh, future victims might find a small measure of justice before it was too late. And because of Emmaleigh, her name would live on, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of innocence stolen, of justice served, and of the darkness that sometimes hides behind a familiar smile.